something is quietly shifting around the Philadelphia Eagles. And if you've been paying close attention, you can feel that this isn't just another draft discussion or offseason rumor cycle. It's a situation that could genuinely reshape the identity of this offense moving forward. Because right now, there is a very real conversation happening about what this team looks like if A.J. Brown is no longer part of it, and more importantly, how they would even begin to replace a player of that caliber. When you start digging into the potential options in the 2026 NFL Draft, one thing becomes clear immediately. The Eagles wouldn't just be looking for any wide receiver. They would be targeting a very specific archetype, a big-bodied, physical, outside receiver, a true X, someone who can line up against press coverage, win in tight windows, dominate in contested catch situations, and be a reliable red zone weapon. That's not easy to find, and it's even harder to replace when you're talking about someone like A.J. Brown. So the real question becomes, which of these prospects actually has the ceiling to step into that role, and which ones are more likely to fall into complementary or even disappointing outcomes? One name that stands out immediately in this discussion is Denzel Boston out of Washington. On the surface, he fits the mold physically. The size is there, the frame is there, and you can see flashes of what teams look for in that prototype. But when you really break down the tape, there are concerns that are hard to ignore. There's stiffness in his movement, struggles against press coverage, and a limited route winning profile. He looks like a player who wins in very specific ways, and at the NFL level, that can become a problem fast. The biggest issue here isn't just the skill set, it's the value. If you're spending a first round pick or even trading up in the second round, you need more certainty, and right now, he doesn't look like a complete enough prospect to justify that kind of investment. Now, compare that to someone like Chris Bell from Louisville, and the conversation changes completely, because with Bell, you're not just talking about size, you're talking about fluidity, versatility, and real upside. He moves differently than most receivers in his size range. He's more dynamic after the catch, more capable of creating separation, and overall, just a more complete offensive weapon. Even coming off an ACL injury, there's a belief that he could be ready by the regular season, and with the current structure of the Eagles offense, featuring DeVonta Smith, Hollywood Brown, and Dallas Goedert, they could afford to be patient with his development. If you're looking for someone who could realistically grow into a true number one receiver over time, Chris Bell feels like the closest match in this class. But not every option needs to be a direct replacement, and that's where the conversation gets even more interesting, because there are players in this draft who might not have that elite WR1 ceiling, but could still play a major role in this offense as high-end complements. Think about the Alshon Jeffrey mold, a player who can step up, make clutch plays, and be a reliable second option in the passing game. Ted Hurst from Georgia State fits that profile extremely well. He brings a mix of body control, vertical speed, and developing route running ability that gives him a strong chance to succeed at the next level. He might not be the flashiest name, and the level of competition raises some questions, but the traits are there. And if he had played at a bigger program, there's a strong chance we'd be talking about him much earlier in the draft conversation. Then there's Chris Brazzell from Tennessee, another intriguing option. What stands out with him is his ability to stretch the field. For a receiver with his size, he shows impressive speed and fluidity, especially on vertical routes and crossers. He's not a polished route runner yet, but the separation ability is more promising than some of the other big-bodied receivers in this class. If he continues to develop, there's a real path for him to become more than just a role player. So when you take a step back and look at the full picture, this isn't just about replacing A.J. Brown, it's about redefining how this offense operates depending on who they bring in. Do they swing big for a potential alpha like Chris Bell? Do they play it safer with a high-end complementary piece like Ted Hurst or Chris Brazzell? Or do they risk it on a player like Denzel Boston, hoping he can develop beyond what the tape currently shows? Because make no mistake, every one of these decisions carries weight, and if the Eagles do move on from A.J. Brown, the margin for error becomes incredibly small. So now it comes down to you. If this team goes after a big-bodied wide receiver in the draft, which direction would you take? And this is where things start to get even more interesting, because wide receiver isn't the only area the Eagles are quietly evaluating right now. While all the attention has been on replacing a potential loss like A.J. Brown, there are other positions of need where the front office could make moves that completely shift how this roster is built in both the short term and the long term. One name that hasn't been talked about enough, but absolutely should be on your radar, is Jacoby Lane out of USC. At 6'4", he fits the physical profile the Eagles like, especially if they're still targeting that contested catch presence. But unlike some of the higher valued prospects, Lane comes with a different kind of conversation. He's more of a developmental player. There are flashes on tape where you see the upside, especially in red zone situations and when the ball is in the air. His length and catch radius give quarterbacks a margin for error that is incredibly valuable. But at the same time, there are clear limitations right now. He struggles to consistently win through contact at the line of scrimmage, and his lateral agility isn't at the same level as some of the top tier prospects in this class. That's likely why he's projected more as a third round option rather than a day 1 or early day 2 pick. And honestly, that might be exactly where the value starts to make sense for Philadelphia. If the Eagles decide to prioritize the trenches early, offensive line, defensive line, or even edge rusher, then a player like Jacoby Lane becomes a very realistic target later on, especially around that 68th overall pick range. And speaking of the trenches, there's another player that feels like he's flying under the radar in a big way, Caleb Lomu from Utah. This is the kind of prospect that doesn't always generate headlines because there's nothing flashy about his game, but when you actually evaluate the consistency, it's hard to ignore. At 6'6" with strong arm length and solid athletic testing, he checks a lot of the boxes teams look for in a long-term starting tackle. What really stands out is the fact that he didn't allow a single sack in pass protection in 2025, and that kind of reliability is something the Eagles value heavily. Now, the interesting part here is how he would fit into Philadelphia's current situation. With Lane Johnson still holding down the right tackle spot, you're not necessarily drafting someone like Lomu to start immediately at that position. But what makes him intriguing is his potential versatility. There's a real belief that he could kick inside and play guard early in his career, similar to how the Eagles have developed players in the past. That gives them flexibility. He can contribute right away while also being groomed as a future replacement on the outside. And then you look at the defensive side of the ball, and there's a name that fits exactly what this team has been building in recent years. Zion Young out of Missouri. This is a classic Eagles type edge rusher, big-bodied, physical, plays with intensity, and brings a level of aggression that you can't really teach. You see the progression in his production as well, jumping from 2.5 sacks in 2024 to 6.5 in 2025, which shows development as a pass rusher. What stands out most is how he would complement the current group, with players like Nolan Smith and others bringing speed and explosiveness off the edge. Adding someone like Zion Young gives you that power element, a player who can set the edge against the run and still collapse the pocket. There are off-field concerns that teams would have to evaluate carefully, and that's always something that can impact where a player ultimately gets selected, but purely from a football standpoint, he fits the mold of what this defensive front has been built around. And then there's the tight end position, which might not be the most talked about need right now, but it's quietly something the Eagles have to think about for the future. That's where Michael Trigg from Baylor comes into play. A former basketball player with a 6'4", 240-pound frame, he brings that above-the-rim ability that stands out immediately. He's the kind of player who can become a real mismatch in the passing game, especially in the red zone. He's still raw, especially as a route runner and blocker, but the athletic traits are there, and if the Eagles decide not to invest heavily at tight end early in the draft, Trigg could be a value pick later on who develops into a key piece over time, especially if you're thinking about eventually replacing Dallas Goedert or at least adding another dimension to that position group. So when you connect all the dots, this isn't just about one move or one player, it's about a much bigger picture. The Eagles are in a position where they could go in multiple directions depending on how the board falls, and every decision they make could have a ripple effect across the entire roster. And that's why this draft feels so important. Because whether it's replacing a star player, reinforcing the trenches, or adding depth at key positions, the choices they make here are going to define the next phase of this team. Now I want to hear from you. If the Eagles do move on from A.J. Brown and approach this draft the way it's starting to look, do you trust this front office to get those replacements right, or do you think this could be a risky turning point for the franchise? Because now we have to address the part of this story that takes everything we just talked about, from draft strategy to roster building, and throws it into a completely different level of urgency and controversy. What's happening behind the scenes with A.J. Brown is no longer just about football decisions. It's become one of the most complex and uncomfortable uncomfortable situations this organization has had to navigate in years, and the latest developments only make it harder to ignore. There were reports, and not just minor speculation, but strong indications that a trade involving A.J. Brown was very close to happening recently. We're talking about serious benaxations with teams like the Los Angeles Rams, where a deal nearly went through. At the same time, the New England Patriots have consistently been linked as a potential destination, and that connection hasn't gone away. It's only gotten stronger. And here's where things take a turn that a lot of fans didn't expect. There's now visible evidence of a close relationship between Patriots head coach Mike Vrabel and NFL insider Diana Rossini, who has been one of the most active voices pushing the A.J. Brown trade narrative over the past few months. That alone doesn't prove anything improper on the surface, but when you connect it to the volume, timing, and direction of the reports that were being released, it raises serious questions. Because from the Eagles' perspective, this starts to feel less like neutral reporting and more like a situation where information is being used strategically, almost like a tool to influence negotiations. Think about it. If constant reports are coming out suggesting that A.J. Brown is unhappy, that there's tension internally, that a trade feels inevitable, what does that do? It lowers perceived leverage. It creates pressure. It subtly shifts the balance in favor of teams trying to acquire him. And if one of the teams most aggressively linked to him happens to have a direct line to the person reporting those updates, you can understand why this becomes frustrating inside the organization. Now, none of this changes one key fact. The interest in trading A.J. Brown is real. Teams have called. Conversations have happened. This isn't something that was invented out of nowhere, but the way the narrative has been driven publicly, that's where the frustration builds. Because the Eagles, led by Howie Roseman, are not a front office that gets pushed around easily. If anything, they've built a reputation for being extremely calculated and disciplined in negotiations. The expectation internally is clear. If A.J. Brown is moved, it will be for a package that reflects his true value. We're talking at least a first-round pick, and likely more added on top of that. Anything less, and it simply doesn't make sense to move a player of his caliber. And that's why, despite all the noise, a deal still hasn't happened. But here's the part that makes this situation so fascinating, and honestly, a little unpredictable. When you combine potential locker room tension, external pressure from other teams, media narratives, and the natural timeline of the offseason, you start to see how this could go in multiple directions very quickly.